Welcome to Books on Air, the podcast that you can't put down. You're about to get a sneak peek at what goes on behind the scenes with authors. We'll find out their secret recipe for creating a book. We'll tell you where they get their ideas, and you'll get the inside scoop on their next project. Want to know more? Well, we'll tell you where to find them on social media. Are you ready? Okay, let's meet the author. Joining me today is a really interesting gentleman. His name is Robert Brown, and we're going to talk about his book, The Sleeping Ute. Robert, welcome.
Thank you.
Now, you do have a very interesting and sort of diverse background. You were a police officer, and so one of my first questions is, why did you go into law enforcement?
Well, law enforcement is something I did when I was in the Army. And I was working at the Boeing Company in Wichita, Kansas, and an opening came open for some police officers, and I just decided to change fields because the aircraft work was getting rather skimpy at that time in Wichita. So I applied for the Wichita Police Department.
Now, you also have a bachelor's degree in administration of justice from Wichita State University.
Yes, ma'am.
How long were you a police officer?
A little over 4 years. My short tenure was due to an automobile accident I was involved in my patrol car.
Now, that was actually a seminal event for you, wasn't it?
Yes, ma'am.
Was that the real start of the book, The Sleeping Ute?
Well, no. I found when I left the police department, being in my 30s and having a wife and 2 children to raise, at first I had to overcome some depression and hard feelings. But that caused me to, of course, have a lot of time on my hands, and I decided that I would write a biography book at that time of my experiences on the police department, because I was with a unit called the Family Crisis Unit, who worked nothing but family disturbances, and I had some very interesting calls that I felt a reader might enjoy reading about. But with all this time, I started writing my biography. As a matter of fact, the first chapter at that time was going to be a biography, and after the first chapter, I got a little tired of talking about I, or me. That just isn't who I was, so I turned it over to a fiction, and from chapter 2 on, the fiction story takes place in a little Indian reservation about 10 miles south of Cortez, Colorado, called the Sleeping Ute Indian Reservation.
Now, what made you choose that as a location for the book? Do you have a connection with that reservation?
Well, I had visited the reservation before, and I had notified my brother in Cortez if any openings ever came up for law enforcement to let me know, and it just so happened that an opening did come up on the Sleeping Ute Indian Reservation for a head of security officer. But at that point, from that point on, like I say, Suzanne, the book is fiction. But I did choose to tell my story and relate a lot of my experiences I'd had on the police department in creating a fictional story at the Sleeping Ute as head of their security.
I'm sure that some of our listeners are thinking, What is the Sleeping Ute?
Okay. If you ever drive into Cortez, Colorado, there are a range of mountains you can view coming in, and the range of mountain resembles an Indian lying down. It even has a figure of a feather on his head, and you can see his feet sticking up. And they call that range of mountains the Sleeping Ute range. And at the foot of that Sleeping Ute range is their Indian reservation, the Sleeping Ute Indian Reservation. And I meet a lot of interesting characters there.
Let's give our listeners an overview of what the book is about, Robert. Give me a little preview of the action, as it were.
Okay, after I get to the Sleeping Ute Indian Reservation, and after an interview with their council, I'm hired as head of security. I meet a very interesting Ute holy man there. I create him in my book, and I have some interesting calls that I make while as head of the security, but most of my spiritual insights come from little picnic lunches we go on up at the holy ground on the Sleeping Ute with this person, the Sleeping Ute Indian holy man that I have created. I relate a lot of my spiritual experiences that I have had, and the metaphysics I want my listener to, or my readers to hear through the Sleeping Ute holy man.
The car accident that you were in, you were lucky to survive. Your pulse was lost twice when you were in the hospital. You were in a coma for a week, and the doctors told your wife when you got out that you were going to be in a vegetative state. All of that is absolutely frightening. Do you bring some of that? I mean, that had to change the way that you think and had to change some things about you as a person. Am I right?
Yes, Suzanne. As a matter of fact, that's in my first chapter before I turn the book into a fiction one, because I feel, finding one's purpose and reason for being remains one of our greatest mysteries on this phase of existence. I find our brief existence here is no more than a twinkling of an eye. And so, of course, my whole purpose in writing this book from this point on is to introduce some thoughts which might act as spiritual rewards and cause the reader to view his fellow man with a little more love and more compassionate feelings. And that's why I say I humbly ask the readers that as they embark on this journey with me, which I think all books are a journey, that they will forsake not their cherished beliefs, but just briefly lay them aside, as we will both be drinking a cup of cold water in a sometimes desolate and parched area called understanding. And I have a lot of nice, better metaphysical experiences in there that I relate to them, and I do most of this through a first person with the Ute Holy Man.
Would you give me an example, Robert?
Sure, I'd be glad to. Okay. Well, Jake and I had went on a picnic this day. Jake loved my wife's lunches, chicken lunches. She would fix us and send on these little excursions with him. And just as Jake talking to me, he says, Robert, your experience was spiritual energy, by focusing your attention on good and experiencing thoughts of love. Where your thoughts are, so is your heart. And that's where your spiritual energy flows. Jake's whole reason, he tells me, for bringing me up to the mountain with him was to help me realize and find my purpose in life. Jake was almost nonstop talk now, and of course I didn't mind listening. I was fascinated by this man. But that's just one of the spiritual connotations Jake tells me during the book.
You served as a minister to the armed forces during the Vietnam War. How did you come to be a minister in Vietnam?
Well, I was appointed by my church. It was we had two air bases. We had an air base there in Wichita, another one in Salina, and a few Army Reserve locations that I attended. And this was something I done almost as long as the war continued, and it was a wonderful experience for me because I loved working with the GIs. You know, I served in the military in Berlin in the 50s before there was ever a wall built there.
Wow, I bet you've got some stories there.
Yes, I do.
You're a very interesting guy. It sounds to me as if you have taken your religious beliefs and a religious view of law enforcement in a way and sort of taken those things and melded them together in this book. Is that a fair thing to say, Robert?
That's a very, very good summarization you've just introduced to us, Suzanne. I think that's a fair statement. I couldn't have said it any better myself.
Oh, thank you. I try to be insightful, and I try to see where people are going and where they're trying to take their readers, because I think that's really important. Tell me a little bit about your writing process. Most writers, when they begin to write fiction, it's a process that's a creative process. I've written fiction myself, and for me, whenever I would sit down at a keyboard or sit down with a pad in my hands, it was like a movie would start in my head, and I would see the action as it unfolded, and I would try to write it down. And I would also dream about certain scenes that were going to happen in the book, and so I'd have to get up at like 3 o'clock in the morning and write it down because I'd forget it. What's your creative?
I've experienced that same thing, Suzanne.
It's interesting, isn't it?
It is.
What's your process like? What's your process like?
Well, I'm like you. If I don't get up and write them down, if I just lay them there and think I'll write that down when I get up in the morning, sometimes I forget the everything I wanted to write down.
Exactly. It's an amazing, slippery process.
Pardon me?
It's a slippery process.
It is. It is.
Is there something that you really want the reader to take away from the book? Is there a bottom line message? Is there a specific thing that you really want them to get as they read through the Sleeping Ute?
Yes, there is. I want him to take away the thought that God is all in all. He fills all space, and there's really nothing else present. He is also all power, and he is the only power that exists, and of course he is spiritual. And so what we have to do in life to understand more of him is to learn more about ourselves and that we in reality are actually spiritual in His image and likeness. There's 4 or 5 different sprinklings I have in the front of the book where I sprinkle these metaphysics in through using Jake in telling me the metaphysics. Actually, my last 2 chapters in the book are mostly all spiritual ideas and thought, and is a summation of the entire book almost. Actually, I'm not speaking too much more about. I have a real surprise for the reader in the last 2 chapters.
Excellent. We don't want to give that away. You have been an absolute delight to talk with today, Robert. I'm really so impressed with you and what you've done. Thank you so much for being our guest today on Books on Air.
Well, Suzanne, you've been an awful easy person to talk to, and I've appreciated your thoughts, and I've enjoyed our brief visit we had.
You've been listening to Books on Air, the podcast that's brought to you on webtalkradio.net. By the way, you can find our interviews on iTunes and iHeartRadio. I'm Suzanne Harris, and we hope you'll join our next Books on Air podcast. Remember, it's the place to be.